So for the last piece of our conversation on negotiation, I'd like to talk a little bit about how time affects negotiations. This is going to tie into some of the things that we've talked about with culture, but not just culture. There's other aspects to be aware of as well. And so one question related to time is when do conflict participants actually sit down at the bargaining table and figure out a solution? And there's two different theoretical perspectives about what are the conditions under which you get people to sit down and talk that political scientists have been working with. And I'll sort of just quickly flag the logic of each of these. One of these is bargaining theory, the idea that the reason why you get conflict is because we can't figure out what would be the appropriate way to settle a dispute because we have different assumptions about what would happen with that best alternative to negotiated agreement. What would happen if there was a war? What would happen if there was a conflict? And because we don't share a common assumption about what that would look like, the way to resolve that is by actually having the war, by doing some fighting. Well, once you figure out pretty quickly that, one country is stronger than the other, then you get a sense of what might happen in the conflict, or that both countries are willing to use military force. Then you really quickly clarify the situation, and then you get to the table and you resolve it. And so if I was going to point to an example of this kind of a conflict that maybe fits that ideal pattern, it might be the 1999 NATO campaign against Kosovo, in which NATO engages in a bombing campaign, resolves the question about whether or not Russia is going to support Serbia, resolves the question about whether or not NATO can do this, and Slobodan Milosevic comes to the bargaining table and cuts a deal and agrees to more or less relinquish control over Kosovo. And that might fit the story pretty quickly, that war was over in a handful of months. The alternative story that we tell about why people sit down to talk in conflict situations is this idea of a mutually hurting stalemate, that you sit down to talk when both parties have reached the realization that they're not going to be able to win the conflict, that they're stuck, that it's going to continue going on and on and on, and they're stuck in a point that's painful, that they don't like, that they can't win, they can't escalate, and they can't sustain the conflict. And that's when they sit down to talk. And that realization tends to come after a very long, protracted time period. It can take years or decades to reach that point of saying, I can't get to where I need to go on my own through unilateral action, through military force. The only way to get there is through negotiation. And so I think an example that maybe fits this story pretty well would be the US interaction with the Taliban in Afghanistan, where initially the idea of negotiating with the Taliban was unthinkable. But after a couple of decades of war, the United States is sort of looking at the situation saying, if there's going to be a solution, it's probably going to involve sitting down and working with the Taliban to figure out what a post-US presence in Afghanistan looks like. Another way to think about how time can influence negotiations is once you get to the table, once you're there and negotiating, how do you decide how much space you have to work out an agreement, right? And there may be time pressure that's imposed because of travel schedules or deadlines that are maybe external. We've got to reach an agreement because the current agreement expires in 2 months. And so we have 2 months to work this out. You may want to think about time spent actually talking at the table versus time that's spent building relationships or showing seriousness. We talked a little bit about the idea of two-track diplomacy, that putting the space aside for parties to be able to explore in a very open and honest and relationship building kind of way through that Oslo conversation allowed for more efficient negotiations to happen later on down the road. And so giving space for that kind of interaction can be really important. And you may not have that kind of space because of time constraints. But there's also a cultural dimension to this too, right? The different cultures have different assumptions over how you engage in negotiations and when you make concessions. And so some cultures view negotiation as something where you just sort of piecemeal give out concessions, that they have to be sort of pried from you, like every single concession has to be just like pulled free. Other cultures, the United States tends to approach negotiation as you move in, you put your cards on the table, you try to be efficient and get things done and move forward as quickly as you can. The Soviet Union, Russia tended to, during the Cold War, take a very different view of when you make concessions. They took the view that you make concessions at the end of the process, right? That that when things are sort of at the very breaking point and when it's going to all collapse, that's when you sort of open up and say, oh yeah, we can adjust, we can go soft in that position that we've been resistant on before. Obviously, if you have two actors interacting, one believes concession should happen early and the other believes concessions happen late, they're going to have very different experiences at the bargaining table, right? The Soviet Union is going to conclude that the Americans are suckers because they're just giving stuff away, left and right, and then are surprised at the end of the talks they're not making additional concessions. The United States is going to feel like the Soviet Union wasn't serious and didn't come to actually bargain, and then all of a sudden they walk away with the deal and they wonder how they got there because of all those concessions that were offered right at the end. It's also worth kind of circling back to the conversation we had about culture and the sort of individualistic and more communal approaches or societies. That these two different sort of cultural clusters, I guess we could call it, may have different understandings of time. And so something that's emerged in the negotiation literature is this distinction between the modern view of time versus the traditional view of time, the modern view being what maybe is sometimes called monochronic, right? So it's time that runs in one direction forward and it's a straight line. And if that's the way you think about time, you think about your day as being divided up into precise units. There's 24 hours. Each hour has 60 minutes. Each minute has 60 seconds. We watch those 6 seconds tick away on the clock. And there's a sense that once a second is gone, that second is lost, right? You can fall behind. You can miss things. You can waste that time. And so time is considered precious. We have the expression, right? Time is money. And there's a sense that we have to get problems done. We have to move on to the next problem, that we shouldn't be wasting or dallying. We should be resolving problems. And we focus on start and end points, right? I teach classes. I've noticed quite a lot over the years that students will watch the clock, and right as it's sort of clicking toward the 50, the 10 minutes to the hour, students start packing up their stuff. And if I keep talking right through the end of class, people get very annoyed. Right? Likewise, I start my classes right on the dot when the clock clicks over to 10 o'clock or whatever. I kick off my lecture because we're operating with a monochronic modern view of time where we live our lives and organize our lives around time as processed through these very precise measurements. We also have rules of this idea that one person should be talking at a time, that we're going to be efficient and pacing and spacing our interactions to conform with time. But that kind of subjugation of the self to time is not universal. And people who maybe have a more traditional view of time don't use the clock to measure time. They use the sun. The sun is up, it's day. The sun is going down, it's evening, it's dark, it's night. Time might be understood in terms of the seasons. This is the season where we do planting. This is the season where we do harvesting. This is the season where we spend time indoors because we'd die if we go outside because it's so cold, right? And that view of time isn't sort of one directional and linear. That view of time is cyclical, right? There's days, and each day looks exactly like the last day in terms of the sun comes up and the sun goes down. And the seasons don't just sort of march one season to the next. They go in a circle. And nothing really changes with that. That's the nature of the universe. Sun comes up, sun goes down, seasons change, seasons cycle. That's not a view of time that encourages being efficient. That's not a view of time that thinks about waste in terms of seconds ticking away. That's a view of time that maybe is more hesitant to embrace this idea of just getting things done and moving on to the next. That approach that Westerners and I think folks who live their life by the clock take can be rude. It can be a sign that you're trying to push things through, and maybe you're being dishonest because there's no need to rush. If it's not done now, it will be done later. It's sort of a tangential thing. I mean, I think traditional views of time are oftentimes associated with agricultural societies, but I've observed this within my own sort of environment within a university, that because things run on a semester schedule, if things are not done this semester, they will be done next semester, and they'll be done in the next academic year. And we think in terms of those kind of cycles rather than in terms of the minutes and the hours and the days marching forward on the calendar. We think in those cycles. And so this traditional view of time does pop up in different types of environments and can shape how we think about things. If I don't get it done this academic year, I'll get it done next academic year, is something I have said to myself more times than I care to admit.